Welcome to the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University. My name's Jennifer Cook, and I'm director of the Institute for African Studies, which serves as a hub for Africa-related study within GW and a center for informed discussion on contemporary Africa policy, debates, and challenges. The Elliott School aims to prepare its students for global engagement through a curriculum that emphasizes leadership, ethics, and practice, and embodying, I think, those principles today, along with the principle of courage. I'm honored to welcome TUNDU LISSU of Tanzania. Tundu is an outspoken champion of human rights and democracy. He's a member of the Tanzanian Parliament, chief whip of the Tanzanian opposition, Chadema. We are extremely lucky to have him here with us today in more ways than one. As many of you may know, on September 7th, 2017, as he was returning from Parliament, men armed with machine guns surrounded Tundu in his driveway and fired 40 shots at him, 16 of them hitting him. The circumstances of the shooting were suspicious. It came after a year in which Tundu was arrested and detained multiple times, charged with sedition, and clearly targeted as among the most outspoken critics of corruption and a series of repressive maneuvers by the president and the government. He was airlifted to Nairobi and thereafter to Belgium, where he has undergone multiple surgeries and is still recovering, but looks hale and healthy and ready to go. From everything we know about Tundu, he is a fighter. As we speak, he's preparing to return to Tanzania to continue his campaign for justice and democracy. Unfortunately, Tundu's story is not unique in Tanzania at this moment. Once hailed as this peaceful democracy and something of a favorite among donors, this attack comes against the backdrop of increasingly repressive policies aimed at silencing critics of the government, human rights activists, and journalists, legislation curtailing freedom of speech and assembly, really the cornerstones of democratic practice. And it comes at a time when democracy in the region and even beyond is under increasing threat. So we'd like to, we're really delighted to have you here with us today. We'll allow you to kind of set the scene for us, and then we'll have a bit of a conversation and open it up to questions from the audience. But thank you very much for being here. It's an honor, and we're delighted to host you and wish you
Well, thank you so much, Jennifer, for that generous introduction. And thank you for having me here. I'm sorry I came a bit late. I managed to mislead everybody, my friends who collected me from the hotel. I told them I used to be a Beltway bandit in the late 90s, so I know DC like the back of my hand. And I managed to lose everyone. So I'm sorry for that. Today is 5th of February, and this day and this date is very important in the history of Tanzania. And it is not just because 52 years ago on this date, the then president, the first president of Tanzania, Mwalimu Nyerere, inaugurated the famous Arusha Declaration, the socialist blueprint for Tanzania, which by the early 1980s had spectacularly failed. And the date is important not because of that. It is important because in today's Tanzania, we are seeing the kind of policies that remind us of the economic folly that befell Tanzania after 1967. We are seeing the kind of command and control economic policies which led Tanzania to near disaster, near bankruptcy by the early 1980s, and which after 1985 were jettisoned, and it was good riddance for the country. But 5th of February is also important because it is the date which 40 years ago, was it 42 years ago? 42 years ago, yes. The nationalist movement for Tanganyika, TANU, which led Tanganyika to independence in 1961, and the Afro-Shirazi Party, which led the Zanzibar Revolution in 1964, merged to form the ruling party which has been in power all these years, Chama cha Mapinduzi. So 5th of February is very important because of these historical facts. But more than that, 5th of February is very important because on this date 3 years ago, on February 5th, 2016, on the 39th anniversary of CCM, President Magufuli, who had just been sworn in as president, he had been sworn in 3 months as president, declared in a televised speech that he would see to it that by 2020, by the year 2020, there will be no political opposition in Tanzania. A nationally televised address that he would want to see Tanzania essentially return to the dark days of one-party rule. I am here today with all that has happened to me personally and all that has happened to Tanzania since that day because of President Magufuli's pledge of turning Tanzania back to where it was prior to 1992. We went multi-party in 1992. So in these 3 years since President Magufuli made that pledge, we have seen the kind of politics that are unprecedented in our entire history. For almost a quarter century of our, during the first quarter century of our independence, up to at least 1992, we were a single-party state. We didn't have a Bill of Rights. We didn't have independent courts. There was no free press. Actually, the only press there was you had only one newspaper owned by the government, Daily News. Other people call it the Daily Noise. And one newspaper owned by the ruling party, Uhuru. So there was no press to speak about, let alone independent press. So we had no Bill of Rights. We had no independent press. There were no political parties because the Constitution declared the country a one-party state. And for all intents and purposes, the sole ruling party determined whether you went to school or you didn't, whether you went to hospital or you didn't, whether you got a job or you didn't. The party was in total control. Now, since 1992, we have had a multi-party state. We have seen democratic space expand. Slowly for some of us, very, very slowly for some of us. In fits and starts. For those of us who are too impatient. But there is no doubt that the democratic space was expanding. We got a Bill of Rights. We got a multi-party parliament in spite of the long shadow of imperial presidency that has always been a characteristic feature of our constitutional order. And you can see during this period an opposition, a political opposition, becoming better organized and doing better and better during elections. So that by 2015, President Magufuli, these are official figures, he got 58% of the total presidential vote. And the opposition candidate, the joint opposition candidate, Edward Lowassa, had 41%. This is unprecedented in our politics. But immediately after President Magufuli was sworn in, as I said, he declared war on democracy. And 3 years later, we share a record of disappearances and abduction of critics and dissidents, which was common in all sorts of obnoxious dictatorships of the 60s and 70s and 80s. Now, even though the Constitution declares the country a multi-party state, even though we have a Bill of Rights, today, for all practical purposes, Tanzania, there is a prohibition on politics declared by the president himself. Don't mind about the law. Don't mind what the law might say. For all intents and purposes, for the past 3 years, there's been a total prohibition of opposition politics. You cannot hold public meetings and rallies. In fact, it has become increasingly difficult even to hold internal party meetings. So at one point, our central committee was raided by the police. They don't have powers to regulate internal party meetings, but that has not stopped them from interfering with our meetings. Hundreds of our party leaders, members, activists are either in jail, or they're being prosecuted through the courts, or they have already served their time. That would be easy. But as I said earlier, we have also begun to see the kind of abductions and disappearances with all the hallmarks of official death squads in Tanzania. Today, it's almost 2.5 years since the personal assistant to my party chairman, the national chairman of my party and the leader of the official opposition in prison, went missing after spending months criticizing academic credentials of President Magufuli. President Magufuli is bandied about as the smartest leader in the continent. Never mind the fact that he cannot string a single sentence in straight English. But this gentleman questioned his academic qualifications and was snatched, and we have not seen him since. It's almost 2 years today since a journalist who was investigating the killings of hundreds of civilians just south of Dar es Salaam, which was carried out by security forces, was snatched from his house in broad daylight. He's not been seen since. It's 3 years since a regional leader who comes from the same region as President Magufuli was murdered in broad daylight, hacked by machetes in broad daylight, and thrown by the roadside to bleed to death, and they took pictures and posted them on social media. No arrest, no investigation, not even a suspect. We speak today, the leader of the largest political party in opposition in the country and the official leader of opposition in parliament, Mr. Mbowe, my chairman, is in prison. Why? Because he got charged with sedition, with one of these, their favorite weapons. And he missed a court appearance when he came to Belgium to check me up. He hadn't seen me since last year. And when he went back, his bail was waived and he's inside 2 months now. And not just Mr. Mbowe, dozens of members of parliament from the opposition, mainly from my party, are facing criminal prosecution. And the standard offense is sedition. Now, our law defines sedition as making or publishing any statement that makes the government look bad. Now, in a multi-party state, in a multi-party democracy, how do you get rid of a government you don't like if you don't paint it black? If you don't show that this government is unfit to rule? Now, that is a criminal offense in Tanzania. I would say it is not entirely Magufuli's fault in this particular case, because our sedition provisions come from the 1950s, from 1953 actually, a year before the nationalist movement was born. It was enacted by the British to deal with the nationalist movement. But Nyerere used it, Mwinyi used it, and Magufuli is using it very, very liberally. 3 years since Magufuli made that pledge, hundreds of bloggers have either been tortured. In my spare time, I'm a defense attorney. And I've spent months or years defending bloggers, young men who send these, innocuous messages on WhatsApp or, Instagram or whatever. And they've been tortured. We now have torture chambers. And many have gone to jail. So, and we've not spoken of my numerous cases and what happened to me on September 7, 2017. Anyway, to cut the long story short, the president's pledge to see Tanzania returning to one-party state by 2020 has been very costly. It has been 3 years of blood, toil, and tears. It has been 3 years of hope as well. I survived. And I think we will survive the Magufuli dictatorship. And one reason why we will survive the Magufuli dictatorship is he's a past genius in the art of making enemies. So he's made enemies all over. He provides us with the kind of opportunity to mobilize the nation the way it has never been mobilized before. So thank you for having me here. Thank you for listening to me. And I'll be happy to answer your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and you can tell that you have that you're a lawyer by practice. You could serve as a professor as well, I'm sure. Listen, that's a very bleak picture that you paint. I wonder, and you pin much of this to the president himself. I wonder if you can say maybe why at this moment is President Magufuli a product of something bigger in terms of the ruling party's maybe sense of fragility as the opposition grows? Why now has this, is it all just about the personality? And two, how much of the ruling party is it just a complacency? Are there skeptics within the party? Or is this something that is kind of a function of the party versus the individual?
But those are very good questions. I think it will not be entirely correct to pin everything in the person of John Pombe Magufuli. It will not be entirely correct. In 1952, barely a year after independence, we did away with the Westminster Constitution that was given to us by the British, which had created the constitutional framework for a liberal state. And we replaced it with the Republican Constitution. That created what constitutional scholars have described as an imperial presidency. In short, our president is an emperor, an almost absolute monarch of the type that was common during the 18th, 19th century Europe, 18th century basically. So the president is so powerful. His shadow is everywhere, not just in the executive, but also in the judiciary, as well as in parliament. And these powers are largely unchecked. Even after we went multi-party state in 1992, and we got presidential term limits for the first time in 1985, the presidential powers under our constitution and laws are still very vast. Mwalimu Nyerere, the founder president, said in 1967 and in 1978 in an interview with the BBC that he had powers under the constitution to become a dictator. So the powers that Magufuli enjoys today are essentially the powers that Kikwete enjoyed, Mkapa enjoyed, and all our previous presidents to Mwalimu Nyerere enjoyed. The only difference is this, that Mwalimu Nyerere was always very aware of the dangers of those unlimited powers. And he said it openly. He always worried publicly about the dangers of these unchecked imperial power. President Magufuli, it's difficult to say that he really knows the extent of the powers under the Constitution, because he seems to believe that whatever he says, whatever comes out of his mouth, is the law of the land. Be it in the Constitution or not, but whatever he says is the law. But it is important to state the fact that the constitutional powers that he enjoys are what his predecessors had. The very strong personal element is in the sense that he relishes these arbitrary exercise of that power. He enjoys, the kind of things that we have seen. Only last month, he declared again on television that he wouldn't want to see a member of the security forces who kills a civilian taken to court or lose their job. Now, this is a presidential license to kill in a country that has seen hundreds of civilians killed by the security forces, and here is the president talking live on TV saying he doesn't want to see any of his security apparatus, members of his security apparatus, taken to task for killing civilians. So he enjoys, it is part of his persona. So it is a personal element, and this, the constitutional order that we inherited from back in 1962. On the question of whatever happened with CCM, his party, CCM is not a political party in the true sense of a political party, a party that derives its legitimacy from civil society. These people have always been in power. There has been a very close, almost indistinguishable interlinkages between CCM, the party, and the state. The president has always been the chairman of CCM. He's also the the commander-in-chief, obviously. You see a revolving door between CCM and the civilian administration and the armed forces throughout our history. Not just during the period of one-party rule, when everybody, including myself, we were compelled to be CCM members. If you wanted to go to university, the first thing you showed was not your academic testimonials. The first thing you showed was your CCM membership card. Now, even during the era of multi-party politics, you still see this revolving door between the ruling party and the state and the army. It's the current publicity secretary, I think, or the director of foreign affairs is an army general. He was a member of the armed forces 2-3 years ago, and today he's, when our constitution prohibits members of the armed forces from being members of political parties. So CCM is not a political party that we understand all other political parties. This is a state party. And its power has always been derived not from the citizenry, but from the state. When they need money, they don't go to their members, they go to the president. And that's why you see we have these never-ending scandals every other election time of government officials plundering the treasury, largely in order to fund their election campaigns. So it is, you cannot think a party, that kind of a party will be able to control someone like Magufuli, because they depend on him entirely. And before Kikwete left office, he said at one of his meetings, you know, CCM should learn to deal with the opposition politically instead of relying on the police force. Because instead of dealing with the opposition in political terms, they have always relied on the violence of the state. Yeah.
What then, and I'm going to open it up for questions because I'm guessing there will be quite a few. What then do you see as kind of the opening? I mean, Magufuli, from reports, and maybe you differ, still enjoys a lot of popularity and kind of this populist move, and we've seen this elsewhere, kind of a populist who is willing to kind of trample democratic norms and process, but still retains a great deal of a strong base within the population. And I wonder how you see that. But then where do you see kind of the wedge for change and the opening for change? And I know you've said that you would like to go back and help. I'm
going back.
You are going back, yes, okay. And I wonder how you think you can be effective and how that change will happen.
The first one, how popular really is Magufuli? If you want to measure the popularity of a president, I think the first thing you look at are opinion polls, right? Now, last year, somebody had the temerity to publish opinion polls, which showed that President Magufuli's approval rating had dropped from the high 80s to about 55%, which would still be very high by American standards, I guess.
These days, yes.
And what happened is this guy was basically stripped of his citizenship. His organization, his polling firm, has been put in a freezer somewhere. And immediately after, a law was rushed through Parliament. It is called the Statistics Act. And it says, if you want to collect any statistics on anything, you had better get permission from the government or its bureaucrats. 1. 2, if you publish your statistics and they tend to discredit or to question or to show fault with official statistics, then that is a criminal offense, and that will entitle you to a substantial jail term or a substantial fine or both. So for all intents and purposes, the only statistics today, the only opinion polls that you can get from Tanzania on how popular the president is would be polls from official government agencies. Everybody else is in danger of being declared a criminal if they dare do so. That is number one. Second, for a president who is that popular, as we are told, why this violence? Why would you want to shut down the press? Why would you want to destroy the opposition? Why would you want to make sure that everybody toes the party line? What is the basis of this fear if you are that popular? We are told, and they say it a lot, that the president has been very strong in fighting corruption. Let's look at the facts. You have to be wary of because I can talk on and on and on. Okay. The point is this. The point is this. In the 3 years of President Magufuli's administration, we have seen hundreds of people detained and charged in courts and charged with these very serious economic offenses, corruption, money laundering, you name it. Hundreds. And last week, a former minister told me, brother, there are hundreds of business people who have been detained quietly, charged with money laundering, their accounts not seized, not frozen, but forfeited without a court order. So if they want your money, they charge you with money laundering or with this or that economic offense. They hold your account. They empty your account of any money there is. And in those 3 years, in spite of these hundreds of people who have been detained and charged with economic offenses, there isn't a single case that is being prosecuted, let alone a conviction. Not a single prosecution. Hundreds are in detention. These offenses are not bailable by our law. So they arrest people, charge them with economic crimes. They cannot get bail. They rot in prison. They rob them of their money. And the police don't investigate. And therefore, there is no conviction. Not a single conviction. 1. 2. In some of the biggest scandals which were investigated by Parliament, by the last Parliament, which I was a member as well, and in which we showed how these people, Magufuli being a minister in the government, had basically helped themselves to the treasury, involving hundreds of millions of dollars, not a single one, and we named, names were named, of very high people, not a single one of them has been arrested or charged. And only this past week, on Friday last week actually, the Parliament Public Accounts Committee released a report which shows that in the past year alone, about $2 billion have gone missing within the government system. And half of it has gone down under the black hole called the president's office. So all these claims about fighting corruption and what, and popularity and so on and so forth, I think they're just a cover for something else. They were used as a cover to destroy the opposition. Yeah.
Thank you. Let's take some questions from the floor. We have student Max Bone.
I was in Tanzania in 2015. My name is Max Bone. I'm a student here. I was in Tanzania in 2015 at the beginning of Magufuli's term, and there was a lot of excitement, especially among people my age there. There were videos going viral of him in hospitals yelling at corrupt doctors and news about officials being fired, and there was a lot of excitement about the anti-corruption drive. Sad to say that doesn't exist anymore, but I'm curious if you could talk a bit about the people that are being convicted of corruption. Are they actually corrupt? Are they opposition leaders? Are they civil society? With all the individuals who are detained, is there at least some degree of a genuine crackdown on corruption? Or is it really just a larger facade to cover all of this? And then what, if it is all fake, what would you say would be a correct way to approach cracking down on corruption, because it is a very large issue? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a great question. In January, on January 9th of 2016, I gave an interview. And this was about 100 days after Magufuli was sworn in as president. And I was asked to give my rating of the first 100 days of Magufuli in office. And I said, Magufuli is a cross, is a hybrid between somebody called Edward Sokoine, who was our prime minister in the 80s, and he died in 1984, and a very popular, very populist minister for Home Affairs named Agostino Mrema in the 90s. And people were very offended by that. And in that interview, I explained that if you look at Magufuli, the Sokoine side of Magufuli is of this ruthless political leader who is not afraid of using government power to crush whoever stands in the way. And of course, Sokoine is very famous because between 1983 and 84, he led a crackdown against what was described as economic saboteurs and, people who were, today we're being told of there is an economic war going on. We were told of an economic war by Sokoine in 1983-84. And in that crackdown in 1983-84, thousands of business people were detained by using the presidential detention powers, which were intended to deal with essentially enemies of the state. So Sokoine used a presidential detention, a preventive detention act to deal with business people. Today, Magufuli is using exactly, he's not using the Preventive Detention Act, but he's using the intelligence and security services, who do not have any police powers in this crackdown on the so-called, he's conducting an economic war today. And as I said, hundreds are in detention, charged with very serious offenses, no prosecution going on, and 3 years later, not a single conviction. Now, he paid a visit to hospitals, to this. That's exactly what Kikwete did in 2005 when he was first elected president. So these are just populist practices, which are very common in Tanzania, but which really have not translated into anything meaningful in practice. Did I answer your question?
What's the right way to come back?
Oh, yes. The rule of law. If you want to deal with corruption in Tanzania today, free parliament. Make parliament what it ought to be, a watchdog of a government. And we don't need to go to Kenya or to the US for examples. We need to draw from our own experience of 10 years under Kikwete. Now, I have personally described Kikwete in some quarters as a mafia boss. You know, he was dishing out government positions to cronies, and his regime was absolutely corrupt. But if there is one thing that is a saving grace, if you may use the term, is the 10 years of Kikwete also saw the flowering of parliament as an independent voice. A lot of corruption scandals that made us very famous. My party became very famous because of using parliament as a platform to, you know, get all this rottenness out in public and so on. So get parliament to do what it ought to do, a watchdog of a government, to supervise government, to oversee governmental operations. Magufuli hates parliament with a passion. Not only the opposition in parliament, we've been beaten up, we've been, you know, brutalized inside the parliamentary chamber, the opposition. That is besides the point. Magufuli hates parliament as an institution. And his first act as president was to elect, well, we still have these beauties in our constitution. The president can still appoint a certain number of members of parliament. All right? So today we have a deputy speaker who, for all intents and purposes, is the real speaker, who is a presidential appointee. And what they have done during these 3 years, this deputy speaker and the parliamentary leadership, is to undermine parliament from within. So today, the kind of debates which had become regular during the 10 years of President Kikwete, today are a pipe dream. The kind of corruption scandals that were you know, dug up by parliament during those 10 years, today is absolutely impossible. Because today the president, and he loves speaking you know, on record. He says to the speaker, get those noisy ones, get them out of parliament, and I will deal with them outside parliament. So the speaker chucks out of parliament, us out, me and my colleagues, and when we just get out of the parliament's gates, we find the security people waiting for us. I've been detained twice and sent to Dar es Salaam, 700 kilometers away, for making statements in parliament, chucked out by the speaker, and then I find my good friends from the security services waiting for me outside. So get parliament free. Get the free press. Get citizens to be free to speak. Get freedom flowering. And if you do that, then all this corruption thrives in darkness. Corruption thrives where the government is unaccountable to anybody. And therefore, the simple antidote to corruption, in my view, is democracy writ large. I saw a hand somewhere. Yeah.
My name is Tara Twing with the U.S. Agency for International Development. What I'm hearing is, yes, I mean, I concur. The way to combat these things is through democracy. But in addition to the extensive presidential powers that Tanzania has constitutionally, the regime has also been very strategic in passing legislation that enshrine what it does in the rule of law. The Statistics Act, the Media Services Act, Cybercrimes Act, and most recently the amendments to the Political Parties Act. So what I would ask you in this environment, it will be very difficult to mount an effective campaign for the 2020 elections for any member of the opposition, and there have been abandonments from the opposition parties back to the ruling party. So I would ask you what you see in this environment as the way that you can, or the way that one might mount a successful campaign.
Thank you very much. We have never had it easy throughout these 27 years of multi-party rule. We have never had it easy at all. Every democratic gain that was made during that period was fought for, and it was paid for very dearly. The situation has become very difficult, absolutely. The legal regime that is emerging during this Tanzania, Magufuli's Tanzania, is horrifying. But what the law proposes, the people will dispose of. It is never easy anywhere. Democracy has never built easily anywhere. Not in the United States, not anywhere in the world, and certainly not in Tanzania. So we'll have to do our bit. We'll have to do our bit to deal with the current difficulties. As I said at the beginning of my remarks, President Magufuli is, in my view, a godsend. It is not just the political opposition that has paid dearly. Magufuli is a Roman Catholic, and he will go down in history, in our history, as a Catholic president who managed to antagonize the Catholic Church in Tanzania. Now, the Catholic Church is the most powerful institution in the country outside the state. Last year, the Tanzania Episcopal Conference wrote a pastoral letter, which basically, what I have said during this half hour, basically the bishops, the Catholic bishops, said it in a very polite, clerical voice. But you have a situation where the church, not just the Catholic Church, the Protestant churches, the evangelicals have expressed themselves very strongly about the way the president has managed our affairs during this period, these 3 years. President Magufuli has attacked the business community with unprecedented violence. And we're not talking of the local business community. That's what Sokoine did in the 80s. He's attacked the local business community. He's basically destroyed 20 years of hard work of President Mkapa and Kikwete in creating an atmosphere that is conducive for foreign direct investment. You know, you will have heard of Acacia, this mining company, which was slapped with a tax bill of $194 billion, not billion shillings, $194 billion, which I described as professorial rubbish, and I was arrested for it. He's antagonized the international community. Our president doesn't travel. His witch doctor must have told him, don't go anywhere near those airplanes. So he doesn't travel. He doesn't go to international meetings or conferences. He's antagonized government employees. He's antagonized everybody. Today, even parliamentarians, CCM parliamentarians, you don't travel outside the country if you don't get permission from the president's office. The speaker said the other day that I have not been, the Parliament has not footed the bill for my medical treatment because the President did not approve. So I got shot 16 times, attending parliamentary sessions, whisked out of the country unconscious. I was in coma for 7 days, and I've been in hospital since, and Parliament has not paid a penny because the President has not approved the release of the money for my treatment. Now, it goes for every member of Parliament, for every judge, for every civil servant. You don't travel if you don't have the President's permission. We are told not a single payment of more than 10 million shillings. 10 million shillings is about $4,000. Now, no payment in the government system of more than $10 million is mad.
10 million shillings.
10 million shillings, yes, 10 million shillings, without the President's approval. And then you have all these multi-million dollar acquisitions of aircraft, which no one knows how they've been acquired, no one knows the contracts. The President is building a 5-kilometer-long runway, an airport in his home village. And when I say he reminds me of Mobutu Sese Seko, people get offended. But that's precisely what Mobutu Sese Seko did in his home village in the middle of the forest. So seriously, we are in for it. Now, the question was, how do we get going against him? Given all this, I think there are objective conditions. Objective conditions exist for mobilization against him on a scale that has never been seen in our politics. It will be difficult. As I said, it's never easy, but I'm totally optimistic. I'm totally optimistic that once we get going, I think, and if we get our act right, because we have to get our act right, if we get our act right, then 2020, a short 1 year away, may witness miracles in the history of Tanzania. And that's why I said it's 3 years of blood, toil, and tears, but these are also 3 years of hope. We have survived. We have survived thus far. The cloud is absolutely black. It's really dark. But if you look closely, there are silver linings all over.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm Leonard. I'm a student here in the Masters in International Policy and Practice, and I'm a national from Cameroon. So your story is really compelling, and it's quite a lot similar to the politics back home in my country. But I think in my country it's even worse than what you're presenting. Over the past, since 1985, Tanzania has had 4 heads of states. And each of them has served like 10 years, if I'm not wrong, compared to my country where we have 1 head of state since 1982 till date. So I'm just wondering, the current situation in Tanzania, how sustainable do you think it's going to be? Like all what President Magufuli is trying to do, trying to convert democracy back to autocracy and all of that, do you really think it's going to be sustainable given that Tanzania is firm on democratic terms, presidential terms?
I think we have not been tested before. The truth is, yes, we have had, Magufuli is our 5th president, and it's only Nyerere who didn't have a term limit. We always, when I was young, we used to sing about Kamuzu Banda, the life president, and no one ever said that, by the way, does our constitution provide term limit for Mwalimu Nyerere? Well, Mwalimu Nyerere was the only one who didn't have term limit. After he left, we introduced presidential term limits. And thus far, they have held. Whether they will the term limits will survive Magufuli is a moot question. Because now there is subterranean debate going on in the corridors of power and within CCM about doing away with the two-term limits to presidency. Magufuli himself has publicly come out against the idea, but to what extent can we take his word, given that he's totally erratic? I will not make comparisons, but it's totally erratic. His word changes according to how he wakes up that particular day. But there is a discussion about removing presidential term limit. Immediately upon assuming the chairmanship of his party, they have introduced a clause in the party constitution, the party statutes, CCM party statutes, which prohibit a sitting president and chairperson of CCM from being challenged from within for the presidency. So there are things that are happening in the dark crevices of our politics, which portend a future that may be inconsistent with this tradition of presidential term limits.
My name is Rebecca. I work with international education at the State Department, and I spent 2013 and 2014 in Tanzania, in Karagwe. Mm-hmm. Yeah, been around a lot of Karagwe and Akiwa. Love it. And I was working with high school and college students there. And in the run-up to the election, what I really saw was just a lot of they wanted change, and they didn't know quite how to get it. There, of course, were CCM stalwarts, but also many supporters of Chadema and CUF. I felt much more in the youth demographic than in the older ones. Right. And, you had seen history of youth protests, along education, access, and things like that. But I hadn't really seen them, maybe because they didn't know how to get engaged. So looking forward to the next election, you talk about mobilizing. What do you think the opposition can do to mobilize youth, especially since they are such digital natives now, and especially in rural areas where, where I was at, we had to wait like 2 days for the newspapers to get shipped there from Bukoba, but they could access information on WhatsApp. But especially now with the censorship of social media and digital platforms, what do you see as a way to best mobilize youth for change for the opposition?
The best way by far is social media. In spite of all the attacks, in spite of this brutal crackdown on social media users, we have not been silenced yet. The youth have not been silenced yet. Newspapers, no one reads newspapers nowadays. So social media is the way of doing it. And when I say we have survived, the fact is, in 3 years in which we have not been able to hold public meetings, social media has taken a kind of importance that is really huge. So it will still use social media. They don't have prisons big enough to imprison the entire population. They simply don't.
Hi, Andrew Bogran from Oxfam. I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit about how the international donor community and also businesses that are in Tanzania should address these challenges. And is there a way to react to the kind of ongoing crackdown? There was, I think, in the news, certainly in the United States, the crackdown this fall on the LGBTQ community was everywhere. It was fairly pronounced, which you don't see from Tanzania. So I'm just curious what your take on is how, in the next year, the next 2 years, how does the international community, how do international NGOs, the business community respond and support a more open Tanzania?
And can I just add to that question? By international community, too, African peer countries. And yes. I wonder if you have allies, if you're seeing any reaction from those regional bodies. as well.
Thank you very much. You see, there are very strong chances that I will soon be stripped of my parliamentary seat. And if I am stripped of my parliamentary seat, it will be because I think for the first time, this debate about what has gone on in Tanzania these past 3 years has come to the attention of the international community in a big way. As we speak, there is no EU ambassador in Tanzania today because Ambassador Roland van der Geer was kicked out, was declared persona non grata in November. And the ambassador was declared persona non grata because for too long he did not shut his mouth up on the abuses that have been going on in Tanzania. And they eventually got rid of him. So as a result, the EU is now reviewing its entire relationship with Tanzania. And not just EU as a bloc, the member states are also reviewing their relations with Tanzania. The United States has put on hold substantial assistance to Tanzania because of these concerns. Now, the issue is this. Over 50% of our development budget every year comes from the donor community, comes from the international community. If you listen to the political rhetoric coming out of Dar es Salaam, all these countries, Americans, Europeans, everybody, you are imperialists. We are going back to the language of the 60s and 70s. You are all imperialists. These are countries that do not wish us well. Now, these also are countries that provide over 50% of our development budget every year, and they have done so for a very long time. Now, my view is, and my position has always been very clear, the international community has a choice with regard to President Magufuli. Number one, because he's intent on destroying democracy, he's intent on turning us into a command economy of the 60s and 70s. He's intent on destroying the gains that have been made over the past 3 decades. You have two choices. You either continue to bankroll him, and he loves it. Every time he gets somebody from the US or Europe or wherever, he says, here, see, they approve of me and my policies. So continue bankrolling a dictatorship, continue subsidizing these attacks on human rights and democracy, or send a message loud and clear that if you are going to destroy democracy, if you're going to kill innocent civilians and you don't want your policemen and women to be held to account, do it, sir, but not with our money. Not with our money. You will be called imperialists, you will be called all sorts of names. We have, as a country, we have obligations to the world. We have signed up to international human rights treaties of all sorts. We have declared to the world that we will respect human rights, that we will not kill innocent civilians, that we will not have extrajudicial killings. that will respect democracy and human rights. Those are our obligations to the world. If we don't discharge our responsibilities to the world has no business giving us a penny of their money. So those are the two choices. You subsidize these government of disappearances and abductions and killings, or you stand up and say, not with our money. The international community has done it before. In the 80s, in the dark days of apartheid regime in South Africa, when, I'm sorry, I don't want to ruffle any feathers, but when President Reagan was unwilling to impose economic sanctions on South Africa, universities across this country, and eventually the Congress, overrode President Reagan's veto and imposed sanctions on apartheid South Africa. And that hastened the end of apartheid. So there is a responsibility that goes with the assistance that you give to our countries. Don't give it without asking questions. Don't subsidize dictators.
My name is Juliet Kwamboka. I'm a fellow at Amnesty International. I'm from Kenya. My question is on the role of the African Union. The African Union is always quiet on human rights violations in Africa. And Tanzania is a member to the African Union. And for several years, the president has failed to attend the summit of the African Union. What has the African Union done to ensure that human rights are protected in Tanzania? And what has the East African community, because Tanzania is also a member of the East African community with several other countries, Rwanda, Burundi. What has this East Africa community done to ensure that Tanzania, which is a member state, upholds the rights of individuals? And so far, great progress has been made on women's rights in Tanzania, and hearing the president making declarations that girls who are pregnant should not go back to school. What domestic remedies are in place to ensure the president does not make declarations that are taking the country back to where women are violated and their rights are not respected? Thank you.
With regard to the African Union and the East African community, the African Union is still very much tied to its OAU past. It's a gentleman's and few women's club. And as such, they are not in the habit of, being too tough on one another. And the best example, I guess, is what recently happened in the Congo, when the AU came out fairly forcefully that was not an election, it was a fraud, and immediately backed out. In these past 16 months in which I've been hospitalized, first in Kenya and then in Belgium, I have had a lot of discussions with officials from the AU headquarters. These are good people. They mean well. But ultimately, the decisions are not theirs. The decisions are made by the Council of Ministers and the heads of state, and and you don't really expect much from that side. The same with East African community. In fact, of the 6 member states now, Kenya is about the only country where we can look for as a model democracy, in spite of the many serious problems that Kenya has. But it's about the only country where you can be a dissident without fear of being visited at night by security operatives. Only Kenya. You cannot expect Museveni or General Kagame or our good friend Pierre Nkurunziza to say anything untoward to Magufuli. And he doesn't care anyway. Because, as I said, he doesn't travel. He is really a son of the soil in a very literal sense. He doesn't travel. He was chairman of SADC for a year. He never attended a single meeting. He was chairperson, not a single meeting. So seriously, and they don't have the economic leverage. It is very important to realize this is a fact. This is a very unfortunate fact. The point is AU and EAC and SADC and everybody else cannot do much because they don't have any leverage over the government, such as Magufuli's. What will they do to him? Send in their army? Do they have armies? Yeah.
Listen, we're at time. I want to thank you for your remarks, taking questions, the excellent questions. I think it's very important that voices like yours are heard here in Washington, and that students and the broader policymaking community can hear directly from you. We're grateful that you spent the time here. It's a tough time. I wish you the best as you return to Tanzania, and I worry for your safety. I don't know how you feel about that. It's a difficult time in democracy generally. We see what's happened next door in DRC, where a winner by 62% of the vote is then left out in the cold, and there's not a whole lot that the international community has been able to do on that. But as you said, I mean, in the days of apartheid, on other big issues, there has been mass mobilization. That's right. Not necessarily by governments, but by civil society groups, by universities, solidarity, kind of transnational networks of democracy promoters, human rights activists. And my hope is that we can support kind of the transformation in Tanzania as best we can. And we will welcome you back here to George Washington on your next visit, and thank you again very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.